Good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's webcast, Research Pipeline. My name is Corinne, and I will be your moderator for tonight's presentation. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. We've taken a screenshot of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer desktop in the upper right corner. You've joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default. This means if you can hear music through your computer, you should be able to hear the presentation. If you prefer to join over the telephone, just select Use Telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address as many as possible at the end. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to take a moment to tell those of you who may be new to the Foundation about who we are, our mission, and what we do. The National Psoriasis Foundation is the world's largest nonprofit patient advocacy organization dedicated to psoriasis and psoriatic arthritis, and we serve as the voice for millions of Americans who are affected by these diseases. Our mission is to drive efforts to cure psoriatic disease and improve the lives of those affected. In order to move our mission forward, we engage thousands of volunteers around the country in activities that will lead to a cure. For more information about these opportunities, log on to our website after today's program at psoriasis.org. Finally, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Eli Lilly and Company, for making tonight's presentation possible. Now I'd like to introduce you to our speaker, Dr. Lawrence Green from George Washington University. Dr. Green is the Assistant Clinical Professor at George Washington University School of Medicine. He's also a medical board member for the National Psoriasis Foundation, and he was a past Board of Directors member for 9 years. He also is a member of the Acne and Rosacea Society. Dr. Green has been called upon for his insight on difficult-to-treat medical conditions such as acne and psoriasis. He is regularly selected to speak to other dermatologists in the field. Dr. Green also oversees a clinical trial center at his office where patrons have the option to participate in clinical trials that offer the latest and most advanced treatments to help and improve their skin. Dr. Green is an author of over 30 medical publications and is also the author of the nationally acclaimed popular book, The Dermatologist's Guide to Looking Younger. He is a frequent Capitol Hill and Annapolis on behalf of research funding for skin disease and physician and patient advocacy issues. In 2010, Dr. Green received President Obama's Volunteer Service Award for his efforts relating to patient advocacy issues. Welcome, Dr. Green.
Thank you, Corinne, and thank you, everyone, for participating. And we'll move on to the next slide, slide 6, and we'll talk about what we'll learn today. And we're going to really quickly talk about the difference between basic translational and clinical research, and we're going to talk about some research related to psoriasis and other psoriatic disease. And really, we're going to look at, this is sort of, we call it the Research Pipeline seminar or webinar, but this really is almost like a pre-research pipeline webinar. We're going to look at very early research, and so you'll see what's in the beginning stages, not what's to come in the near future, what may come in the not so distant future, but not in the near future, because we want to really give you a good look and a good background at the potentials. That potential that's going to be out there and some of the new and exciting ideas that are coming out to treat psoriasis. And a lot of that has to do with the MPF grant recipients and the work they're doing. So that's what we're going to go through today, and of course hopefully have some time to answer some questions at the end. So we'll go on to slide 7 about the psoriatic disease overview. And you can see that psoriasis and psoriatic arthritis are lifelong autoinflammatory diseases. That's what we call them. And they have multiple triggers that we don't know all of them. They certainly have a genetic basis. It involves an overactive immune system that causes inflammation throughout the body. And that's very important, not just on the skin. The skin is just tip of the iceberg when it comes to the inflammation that the psoriasis causes and psoriatic arthritis causes in our immune systems. And that can lead to a host of issues that our body has to deal with if we don't treat it. But of course, we all know that psoriasis is not contagious. So we'll go to slide 8, and the process in the people, you can see that. So you can see how difficult it is for a medicine to make it to market. So this is, and we're going to even talk about things today that are before that drug discovery. We're going to talk even before that 10,000 compound stage. So we're even going, that's what I mean, we're really going even before that stage. But it's very difficult for that medicine and that idea to make it to the market. You can see in the bottom half of the slide that how you can work with these ideas and how they get developed, how they're implemented. Lots of things go into making a medicine. It's not so simple. Lots of ideas, lots of people, lots of effort. And that one medicine that gets approved, 10,000 for every one medicine, there's 10,000 that didn't make it that a lot of money is being spent on. Okay, we'll go to the next slide, and slide 9. So why is research important? Well, to me and probably all of you guys, it's very important because we don't have a cure. We know psoriasis is autoinflammatory. We know there's multiple triggers. We see the inflammatory process from multiple ends and multiple new ways. We're looking at to try and stem that inflammatory process, but we don't have a way to cure it at this time. So we're always looking for new angles. And that's why the MPF is so important in terms of funding research and especially new ideas. So we'll go to the next slide about types of research. We're going to talk about this briefly. Basic research, translational research, and clinical research. Those are 3 types of research. We start with basic, then you go to translational, and then to clinical. So the next slide, types of research, basic. Basic research, as the slide says, answers questions about how the disease affects works or affects the body. So we want to know what happens, what type of inflammation is involved in psoriasis on a cellular or even molecular level. So we're going way down, we're finding out what's going on in the body when it comes to psoriasis. We can go to the next slide about translational research, and that's the research that uses the discoveries from the basic research and turns them into treatments that can then be tested. So we're not testing them yet in translational. We're testing the ideas about the new pathways and molecules in cells that we found out. So research are basically asking, do currently available systemic treatments improve, for example, the symptoms of heart disease? So that psoriasis leads to heart disease, I guess that's something I didn't mention, but that's one of the things we found out in basic research, and we're going to get into that a little later. But we found out in basic research through NPF-funded studies that psoriasis can lead to heart disease because of all the inflammation in the body. So the translational end will ask, do the treatments that we have for psoriasis, it's already approved, and we're going to that end, improve the symptoms of something we found on the basic research level? So we'll move to the next slide about clinical research. And this is also a very busy slide, and I'm not going to go through all of it. You can read through it or take a picture of it, screenshot it if you want. But basically it talks about how clinical research is very involved. You have to have preclinical testing. You have to do it in the laboratory. And you have to make sure that your idea, your concept works on a cellular level, your treatment. Clinical research means it's a treatment, like a medication. So you want to see if it works on a cellular level. You have to write a protocol for it. You want to see it works on animal models. There are no animals that have psoriasis, but there are nice mouse models where you can simulate psoriasis in mice. Then we move on to using it in people. But what's the dose? So you have to find, we don't know the correct dose, so you have to work on dose finding studies and have proof of concept studies to show that at the doses you're selecting it actually does work. And the last type of stage of clinical research is a comparative efficacy, which is actually compared not only to placebo, but the FDA often requires companies now to compare to existing treatments on the market to see that it's at least as effective, if not more. And then, of course, you have data analysis and all sorts of follow-up, because once a therapy is out on the market, you want to follow it up for safety reasons for years. There's a lot of continuing testing that go on even after a product's been on the market. So we'll go to slide 14, current and future MPF-funded research, and this is some studies that the MPF is funding, and we can categorize these not only by their phases or types of research, but also by the topics they explore. So in the next few slides, we'll be highlighting some of the researchers and the key projects that the MPF has funded, and you'll notice that these projects touch on all the topics that I'm mentioning here. So we'll go to the next slide. I think it's amazing. When I was on the board of directors, I started probably 12, 13 years ago, and I served on it for 9 years. We funded, we being the MPF, no research. We had a nice board president, and we hired a new president who's currently the president of the MPF, and we really wanted to spend more time and effort devoted to research. So we established grants and people don't, and all this money comes from donations because that's how the MPF exists. So you who donated, people who donate, and we've invested from money that has been given to the MPF over $15 million in less than 10 years, about 10 years in research since we started doing this. And I think it's incredible. So the MPF is looking, and the research is not, again, in the clinical stage. We're looking at the very basic stage. So we have things called discovery grants that allow researchers to undertake preliminary and proof of concept studies. The goal is to help researchers develop competitive grant proposals that will lead to long-term funding from the NIH or other federal agencies. The MPF's translational grants focus on helping scientific discoveries from clinical, laboratory, or population-based studies to move rapidly into treatments that have a clear benefit for patients with psoriasis and/or psoriatic arthritis. The MPF Medical Dermatology Fellowship Program aims to increase the number of scientists focused on studying and treating psoriatic disease by encouraging young scientists to become physician researchers and dedicate their careers to the study of psoriasis. That's always difficult because there's a lot of competition in medicine, and we have all these young researchers. We want them to study psoriasis. We want the brightest to go into study psoriasis. That's the purpose of the MPF Fellowship Program. And there's also early career research grants that sort of do the same thing. They support graduate students and postdoctoral researchers to conduct training in psoriasis and psoriatic disease. The bridge grants will support researchers who have submitted meritorious but unsuccessful applications to the NIH or NIAMS with a focus on psoriatic disease and related comorbidities. And through this special opportunity, the MPF tends to provide a critical year of additional support to near-miss applicants so that they can collect data to strengthen a future application. So if they didn't make it, we think it's worthy. We want them to keep trying. And the Public Health Challenge Grant will support research that uses existing data sources to address questions related to the public health of psoriatic disease. So, for example, research areas identified by the Center for Disease Control and things like that. And the MPF also works with the Arthritis National Research Foundation on research grants as well. So that's it. That's that in a nutshell. Let's go on to the next slide and talk about our grant. One of our first grant recipients one of our grant recipients from last year, I should say, Amy Paller. She received a discovery grant, and her hypothesis is that the regional skin knockdown of IL-17RA using novel technology, single nucleotide technology, will efficiently suppress the psoriatic phenotype in mouse models. So she wants to see basically the ability of IL-17, and IL-17 is a cytokine. It's a molecule that's involved in psoriasis. It's one of the inflammatory cytokines that's involved in the direct pathogenesis of triggering a psoriasis response. So she wants to see if we can topically create an IL-17 single nucleotide that can prevent and reverse clinical features of mouse model-induced psoriasis. So she's doing it on animals. So there are no topical cytokines because cytokines are very unstable, and we have no way of stabilizing them. That's why we give them the injections, the anti-cytokines. So she wants to see if she can use these single nucleotides to try and stabilize the cytokines and go from and see if that'll help psoriasis. So we'll move on to the next slide, slide 17, and that's another grant recipient from in 2016. And that's a translational grant. So the first slide we saw was an example of a discovery grant, and this is a translational grant. And this is Dr. Sarkar, who has a hypothesis that TYK2 and its genetic variants modulate a set of inflammatory pathways in different cell types in psoriasis. So this is an inflammatory pathway that's not been well studied in psoriasis. So we're looking for novel approaches, okay, to potential therapies. And he wants to determine the role of these molecules that you see in the screen and their cytokine responses in skin cells. And he wants to see what they exactly do and how this inflammation contributes to psoriasis. So we'll go on to the next slide. We'll talk about some of the 2016 MPF Fellowship recipients. Dr. Yun Tong from UCSD, and he's a young investigator. Remember, the fellowship recipients are people they're bright minds. We want to stimulate them and give them and they have good ideas. We want to keep their ideas going, and we want them to start careers in psoriasis so the best minds come and study psoriasis. And this young doctor is under the mentorship of a well-established doctor at UCSD, Dr. Gallo, and the study aims to understand the Kebner phenomenon. That's when you scratch your psoriasis a lot, it spreads to areas adjacent to where you're scratching it. It's called the Kebner phenomenon. It's discovered by Dr. Kebner over probably 100 years ago now. So we want to understand what genes are expressed when this happens and why this happens. Why scratching your psoriasis triggers psoriasis, in adjacent areas. So we'll go on to the next slide, talking about one of our grant recipients, an early career research grant. And this is Dr. Mogulenko, and he is abroad. We don't limit our grants to just the United States. We pick the best and brightest anywhere around the world. That's what the MPF goal is. And he has a hypothesis that metabolic components linking obesity and psoriasis identified by his research will pave new pathways for prevention or therapeutic intervention in psoriasis when we can control the IL-23 producing dendritic cells in obese patients with psoriasis. So people with psoriasis tend to be more obese. Is there something wrong? Is there crosstalk between psoriasis and obesity? How is IL-23, which is another cytokine like IL-17, it's sort of in the same pathway, involved in this process? That's what he aims to find out. So he wants to study all this and study and other metabolites and how this goes in IL-23 and how it's related to obesity. So we'll go to the next slide, which talks about Dr. Soy, and he's someone who was a recipient of our psoriatic arthritis research grant. Dr. Soy has an hypothesis that by applying advanced statistical and computational approaches to genetic data, we can develop robust psoriatic arthritis specific signatures to accurately estimate the risk and other associated clinical features of psoriatic arthritis. So basically, he's trying to find more ideas about the genetics of psoriatic arthritis. And he wants to give a nice sample size and enhance the genetic resolution for psoriatic arthritis data sets. He also wants to build a computer-generated pipeline to facilitate personalized healthcare for psoriatic arthritis based on genetic data. So he's really got a nice, bright idea. We're at the very beginning stages. We don't know how this is going to work out, but he really wants to work with psoriatic arthritis and see the genetic basis and how we can get sort of personalized therapy. Brilliant, another what I think is a very brilliant idea. Move on to the next slide, and we'll talk about a MPF fellowship recipient in a translational grant. This is Dr. Balmer of the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, and she is working under Dr. Nahal Mehta, who himself was a young researcher that the MPF funded. And she wants to study the link between psoriasis and heart disease. Dr. Mehta, as a bit of background, was a young researcher. We funded him before he came to the NIH, when he was in Philadelphia, and he himself was a young researcher. He had an idea that the inflammation in psoriasis that goes throughout the body can link to heart disease and other vascular disease, and he started proving this with one of our grants, and he developed that into a multi-million-dollar NIH grant. So what we funded him way back, I think it was probably 8 or 9 years ago now, led to the NIH saying, hey, there's a lot to this. We had no idea that psoriasis can be related to inflammation throughout the body and causing heart disease. So because of our efforts funding him, because of his efforts, he's now the lead senior researcher looking at these links, and he now is a young researcher who submitted a translational grant to help better understand on how to treat heart disease in people with psoriasis. So we'll go to the next slide. About past grant recipient updates. This is a gentleman, a doctor from the University of Rome, and it's a translational grant we funded in 2011. He identified that LL37 that I think we talked about earlier that someone's still looking into more. It's a prospect autoantigen that can trigger the inflammatory cascade for psoriasis. So it's the initial trigger. We're always looking for what is that antigen? What triggers all the inflammation in the cytokines like IL-23, IL-17 we talked about? What is happening? What triggers it? So because of our grants, Dr. Costanzo founded this LL37, and we're trying to understand what is this for sure the right one? It turns out it's not really the trigger in everyone. It could be in up to 75% of people or maybe a little less, but it's a great first start to find that initial source. And that's something that we funded, the NPF funded back in 2011, and it's leading to future research that can still be funded. Let's go to the next slide about Dr. Elaine Husney from Cleveland Clinic. We funded a psoriatic arthritis research grant in 2010, and she used ultrasound techniques on psoriatic arthritis patients to search for buildup of fat and cholesterol in the blood vessels, and this can be an early sign of heart disease. It's amazing. She found that it was almost 40% of patients who have psoriatic arthritis have signs of vascular occlusion, blood vessel occlusion in their blood vessels. So we'll go on to the next slide on past grant recipient updates. Dr. Capon from London. This is a discovery grant from 2012, and this identified gene mutations that may cause a particular type of psoriasis called pustular psoriasis, a small subset of psoriasis, hopefully to help us better understand how pustular psoriasis works, because that's a small subset, not very common. What goes different in pustular psoriasis than other types of psoriasis? So we have some ideas thanks to a grant the MPF funded in 2012. Another past discovery grant recipient is Dr. Jubin Ryu from UCSF. This is one we funded in 2014. He developed a skin patch that we can allow for a pain-free way of taking biologics as a topical. Remember I mentioned that biologics are very unstable. Cytokines are very unstable, and anti-cytokine molecules are unstable. That's why the stomach would break them down. We can't take them orally. Someone's working, I mentioned earlier, someone's working on a way to try and get them through the skin that's topical. And Dr. Rio also tried to create a patch to make tiny marks on the skin with microneedles, so it allows it to be delivered to the skin. It's still sort of like an injection, but it's microneedling, or microneedle, so you don't feel it as much. So it's not really topical, but it's it feels like topical. So a nice novel idea. The next slide about past grant recipients. This talks about Peter Rinkovich, and this is interesting. He found this again a completely novel way of potentially treating psoriasis. He found that inhibiting epithelial sodium channels, which you see here, epithelial ion channels, prevents aberrant signaling pathways in psoriatic skin cells. And he tries to understand how this works, and could this potentially lead to a therapy for psoriasis? So what's going on in these channels within the cells? This is not just on the cellular level. This is between the cells, the channels between the cells, and maybe these epithelial ion channel receptor inhibitors could work as a topical therapy if you can inhibit the connection between the two cells, the channels between the two cells that are inflamed in psoriasis. So also a novel idea. We'll look at another one. From Dr. Richland, that's the next slide, slide 26, from the University of Rochester. He's received multiple MPF grants and also an award from the NIH, which followed for his research in psoriatic arthritis. And he was investigating how a type of cell is responsible for bone loss. So we want to, again, try and find out which patients will get psoriatic arthritis, which patients will respond best to treatment, why some patients get worse, so new ideas. The next slide talks about Nicole Ward. She's a very famous researcher we funded, very bright. She's in Cleveland. She works primarily on mouse models of psoriasis, and she discovered by blocking IL-6, which is one of the other cytokines, there's an increase in other inflammatory proteins involved in psoriatic disease, so that's not a cytokine you'd want to block when someone has psoriasis. So these findings may result in understanding better how to treat psoriasis and psoriatic arthritis. Again, very interesting and important research. The next slide talks about Dr. Wilson Lau, his lab. This is basic genetics research on non-coding RNA. Basically, this could be something down the line that, where we find and then we shows that the difference between non-coding RNA between people who have psoriasis and their plaques, and in normal skin where they don't have psoriasis and in their plaques, once it's treated and once it's not treated. So non-coding RNA basically means the RNA, we code RNA normally that's useful to create proteins, but some of it's not used. We don't know what it's for. And there's a lot of it that's not used, I should say. So Dr. Lau looked at what we don't know, sort of junk RNA. It's not really junk. It's RNA that may have obviously uses in the body we just don't know about. So he's looking at, again, novel ways potentially treat psoriasis in the future. We don't know what this means, but it's a great first start, looking at things from many different angles that are very different and unique. And again, this is basic science research at the bench level. The next slide talks about translational non-MPF research in implantable converter cells. This is another translational research idea, but it's on the very basics, on the cutting edge, and the MPF funded this. So basically, this group designed a circuit that would automatically sense the presence of two disease-causing molecules called cytokines in the body. We've talked about that, and respond by triggering the production of two other cytokines that would turn off those cytokines. So we would create anti-cytokines through a circuit. This circuit was genetically engineered in a mouse-type cell. And in turn, the cell is implanted in mice with psoriasis. When levels of cytokines that we see in psoriasis, like TNF and IL-22, peaked in the body, and psoriasis was rampant, this synthetic circuit kicked into gear, converting these cytokine signals into an anti-inflammatory cellular output, which led to the production of cytokines IL-4 and IL-10. And those cytokines are anti-psoriasis cytokines. So they turn down the inflammatory pathway. So here's an idea of like sort of tricking the body into creating new cytokines that we know turn down psoriasis only when psoriasis is flaring. They wouldn't happen unless psoriasis was flared. So you have to have that trigger. You have to have that trigger in the signal. So it's a new concept of synthetic biology, and with flip switches, therapeutic switches in people. And this could be useful not just for psoriasis if it works, but any potential disease. If you can have a switch where you know how to turn it down, once it gets turned on, we can just turn it down. And when it gets turned down and it's not needed, it turns off. Very bright, novel idea to potentially treat psoriasis and other diseases in the future. So the next slide goes back to Dr. Mehta's study. I mentioned about vascular inflammation in psoriasis. Dr. Mehta is that researcher, that young researcher who's in Philadelphia, and he discovered this whole, that we funded him, and he turned that about inflammation in psoriasis and in heart disease, causing heart disease. We funded him. He turned that into a huge NIH multi-million-dollar grant. So you can see here in this picture how all those black areas are people who have inflammation in those areas, and a lot of that inflammation is in blood vessels. And we also now have some clinical information that biologics, some of the therapies we use to treat severe psoriasis, actually lower the vascular inflammation seen here. So there we made that therapeutic switch, so we know causes, we know effect. Can we turn off that effect with medications that are currently available? So I'm winding down here. We'll go to the next slide, slide 32, about future research, about the citizen scientist. This is the MPF Research online patient community. It's the first ever global online research network, and it's developed by the National Psoriasis Foundation. So basically, you sign up, you answer questions about yourself, you play with the data and information, and you can also ask questions, and you can see the data that you put in and everyone else's data as well. Go to the next slide. You can see sort of how it works. This is what you see on the website. And it's a great way to get involved yourself and be your own citizen scientist. So I'll just have some key takeaways on the last slide here, I think, or slide 34. There are 3 stages of research. We have basic, translational, and clinical research. Psoriatic disease research explores genetics, treatments, and comorbidities. And please get involved in research. You saw, in this short presentation, how many different ideas are out there to try and knock down psoriasis, and how even so it's a complicated process, but we want to hit it in as many different ways as possible. That's the whole idea about the MPF funding research grants. That's why we all contribute to the National Psoriasis Foundation, that's why it's so important to contribute, because this is how we find cures. So you hit it as many angles as possible because it's a very complicated process. So we'll go to the next slide, and it's time for questions and answers. And I will go from there.
Great, thank you so much. So yeah, we've had some great questions come in. The first one that we've seen a couple times come up from different participants is, in your opinion, how close are we to finding a cure for psoriatic disease?
Boy, that's a great question. I don't think we're that close at this time, but we're getting closer every day, that said. Because 10 years ago or even 15 years ago, we couldn't even treat severe psoriasis. We had no idea about links with vascular inflammation and heart disease and that psoriasis, the skin that we see that bothers us, that itches, that bothers us so much is really, again, just a bit of what's really going on in the body. And so we're learning more and more. We're going by leaps and bounds, but we still have a ways to go, unfortunately. But with ideas and funding from all these novel ideas, like some of what you saw in the session in the last half hour, I think we'll get there, but we're not there yet.
Great, thank you. Next question here. Are there any new psoriasis treatments in the pipeline that are not biologics or steroids?
Are there any? Well, that's a good question. Yes, there are new treatments in the pipeline, and the treatments I'm going to mention now are not what we talked about in the seminar, in the webinar. The treatments I'll mention now are way past. The webinar was just pre-pipeline treatments, like I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. There are treatments called JAK inhibitors. We have other ways of reducing inflammation with novel pathways that are being used to treat psoriasis that are not biologic. So we have some oral medications coming out. There's some topical medications that are being developed that are not topical steroids as well to treat psoriasis. So there are things coming out in the next few years. The answer is yes, I guess, to that question.
Great. Next question here. Has there been any research on the link between dietary habits and psoriasis?
That's a great question, and the answer is a resounding yes. Hundreds and hundreds of papers that, at least in the last 10, 15 years that I've looked at, have been looked at various links between diet and psoriasis, whether it be certain diets like eating fish, heavy fish and fish oils, or gluten, not having gluten in your diet, and all sorts of variations on the theme. But unfortunately, we really haven't found any links between diet and psoriasis that have been really proven. Something that just hasn't been shown in all the many, many studies that have been tried and looked at. But it is something that we still actively look at because you never know. But to date, no links have been found.
Okay, thank you. Next question here. Have adverse effects of biologic medications been widely observed?
Have adverse effects of biologic medications been widely observed? Well, it depends what you define as an adverse effect. Any medication, whether topical, biologic, or by pill, can have an adverse effect. We hope that those adverse effects are unusual, and that's the key thing and the most important thing. Nothing is safe. You can have an adverse effect from taking Tylenol, simple Tylenol. People can die from taking a Tylenol. It's unusual, so that's sort of the concept. Adverse effects can always occur. We want them to be unusual or rare, because a medicine that is approved by the FDA, that's gone through all the testing that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, we want to have the least amount of adverse effects possible. So yes, it's always possible with any medication, I guess, is the general answer to that question, but we hope it's minimal.
All right, thank you. Next question here. Why do the current biologics stop working, and what can be done to maintain their efficacy?
So current biologics do not stop working. They're not supposed to stop working. In fact, the idea when you start a biologic is to continue in that biologic to control your psoriasis. If you have severe psoriasis, hopefully it will never stop working. But sometimes people's psoriasis goes beyond what a biologic can do. For some reason, the psoriasis is not always at a steady state. There's exacerbations and remissions and flares, and sometimes that's beyond what the current biologic you're on can take. So biologics don't necessarily always stop working. Although there's one way to make a biologic start working. Some of the biologics are antibodies that aren't fully human, and if you stop them and you go on them and off them multiple times, your body may develop immunity to them because they're antibodies. So the whole idea is that's why we always recommend never stopping a biologic, and your psoriasis is really clear for a long time because you sort of going on and off can lead to immunity to a biologic in the antibodies. But in general, like I said in the beginning of the answer, is that they don't stop working. Sometimes the psoriasis gets worse, and we need to move on to something different. Exception to that rule is the autoimmunity antigens to people start and stop them. And I guess that's the long-winded answer to your question. Good question.
All right, thank you. Next question here, kind of off of a previous question. What's the best way for patients to stay informed about long-term safety of the drugs they're on?
I think there are a few best ways to stay informed about the long-term safety, and I mentioned earlier in the talk that that's a concern. Once something gets approved, the clinical testing does not end for years and years. So once a new biologic, or new medication, or new pill, or new topical gets approved, the testing continues. It may have been tested in 3,000 people for 5 years before it gets approved, but that's not enough. And that's just an example. We always want more. We want more and more information to make sure something is safe and nothing new is happening. So that always continues. So the best way of looking at it, I think, the easiest way, is through the National Psoriasis Foundation. The MPF is always going to have stuff on, whether it be on their web pages somewhere about the latest research and things that happen. A lot of times you can see it on online message boards. You'll see something like that you can learn from, also through the MPF. Another way is through the FDA. The FDA always has adverse events posted. That's getting a little more complicated to find, but that's another way of going and getting some good, real information.
Great, thank you. Next question here. Does my having severe psoriasis mean that I definitely have or will have heart disease?
So that's a great question, and the answer is unknown. All I can say to answer that question is the longer you have untreated severe psoriasis, the more likely you are to have heart disease. But not everyone will get heart disease. There's a lot of factors that play in the role. Genetics plays a role, how you take care of yourself, what you eat for your heart, how much exercise you do, things like that. So the answer is no, but you have a proclivity to having heart disease if you have long-term untreated severe psoriasis. So the information seems.
All right, great. Next question here. Let's see here. Is research looking at whether any treatments don't work as well for the older population?
I haven't. That's a very good question. I'm not aware of treatments not working well in the older population. As far as I know, treatments work just as well in the older population as the younger population. Sometimes treatments will get FDA approved for a certain age group, but that doesn't mean they wouldn't work in the older population. This just means the testing was done, for example, in ages 21 to 65 or 18 to 65. That doesn't mean people over 65 that didn't work, but the FDA will approve only where only the age of the population that was tested. For some reason, no one over 65 was in the clinical trial, or the pharmaceutical company just wanted to have it from 18 to 65. That was their decision. They had no one over 65, but that doesn't mean it's not helpful in people over 65 or older people. So I would say to that question, talk to your doctor. Just because the treatment may not be approved in an older population doesn't mean it won't work, because medications work just as well in an older population as younger population, unless you're on sometimes older people on certain medications or they have kidney problems, then the medication may not work as well. But that's because of comorbidities, not because of the medication itself. A lot of good questions, Karine.
Great. We have another one coming in here. How close is research to finding a way to test for psoriatic arthritis rather than just doing elimination?
That's a good question, and unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that one. I'm going to say I don't know. I am not a rheumatologist, just a dermatologist, but I do know there is no current test for psoriatic arthritis. It's a clinical diagnosis or diagnosis of exclusion when we don't have, we know it's not other types of arthritis that we can't test for. A rheumatologist would probably know more than that, and I apologize, I don't have a better answer.
Great. On to the next question here. Is eczema something that starts psoriasis? Also, can both skin conditions be present at the same time?
So that's a good question. Eczema and psoriasis are very different things with very different cytokine profiles of inflammation. Eczema also has inflammation, but it's a different cytokine profile of inflammatory cytokines than psoriasis. Certainly, you can have eczema and psoriasis in the same person. They're just unlucky that they have two types of autoinflammatory conditions that have a different genetic basis. But that's not the usual. That'd be the unusual.
Great. Next question here. Because of the comorbidities associated with psoriasis, do patients die earlier than average?
Well, yeah, people with psoriasis who have untreated psoriasis, it looks like they do have a shorter life span than people who treat their psoriasis, or people who don't have psoriasis, I should say. We don't have any information on people who treat the psoriasis, but that's an assumption. If you treat your psoriasis, you will have a longer lifespan, although that hasn't been proven. But that's a very good assumption, because of all the inflammation and the stress it puts on the body. I should say the stress that the inflammation you have on the body it puts on the body, and can lead to potential comorbidities. People with untreated severe psoriasis do appear to have shorter lifespans. That's untreated.
Okay, next question here. Is there any link between psoriasis and migraines?
That's a great question. I don't know of any link. That's a simple answer. I haven't heard of any, and maybe someone can get back to that and do a quick research web search, but I don't know of any.
Great. Next one. If an obese person loses weight, does this help improve or cure psoriasis?
So that's another good question. Anything that puts a stress on the body is going to worsen your psoriasis. And anything where you have bad psoriasis puts a stress on the body. It all goes together. So you want to minimize stresses as much as possible. One stress is psoriasis. Another stress is obesity. Drinking is another stress. Smoking is another stress. Not having a good diet is another stress. So, not being physically active is another stress. So the more stresses you put on your body, the harder it's going to be for your body to function. I think that's the simplest way of looking at it, and to function normally and lead a long lifespan. You want to minimize stresses. So certainly I think if you lose weight, you may not cure your psoriasis, but you're going to make it easy for your body to treat your psoriasis.
Great. Let's see here. Next question. Is there any research being done to look at the link between cancer and the use of biologics?
There's always there are always studies being done to look at any time a biologic is approved. We want to continue studying it, look for any links for not just cancer, but any adverse events that may be seen. They seem to be very unusual. Biologics suppress the immune system, but we're getting much more specific in their targets, and they're suppressing just the psoriasis inflammatory pathway. So we think so there's going to be less risks for cancer and other adverse events or infection, but we're always looking for any links all the time.
Wonderful. Next question here. Is it possible to only have psoriasis during your whole life and never get psoriatic arthritis?
Definite yes to that question, and that's more common than not.
Great. Is there research about the connection between psoriatic disease and mental health beyond anecdotal evidence?
It depends what you call anecdotal evidence. There are definite statistical links and clinical evidence of that people with psoriasis are more depressed. Many studies have shown that, and it's quite obvious to see why. If you have severe untreated, any disease that's severe and untreated, you're going to be depressed. So that's a link that's been well shown. That's not anecdotal. It's a definite.
All right, and one more question here. Is there a way to test a person's cytokine levels?
Which cytokine? Yeah, you can certainly, in clinical research, you can test for what cytokines are inflamed in psoriasis, but they're not clinical tests we do every day. But there are thousands of cytokines. Remember, we talked about that switch idea of turning on good cytokines to turn down the bad cytokines when you have psoriasis inflammation. So there's all different types of cytokines. Some will promote psoriasis, some will help limit psoriasis, some will make no difference in psoriasis, like the atopic dermatitis or eczema cytokines are unrelated to psoriasis. So there's tons of cytokines. But can you test for a specific cytokine inflammation? The answer is yes, but it's not done. It's a research test at this time. It's not done on a regular basis. It's just done in research.
All right, and let's see here. Another question here. How does one become a citizen scientist?
We answer that one. We can put the slides up again if you want. But go to the NPF Citizen Scientist website.
Perfect. Okay, here. And we have a question. How does alcohol enhance psoriasis?
So we talked about that. Alcohol is stress on the body. And any stress on the body is going to promote psoriasis or promote anything in the body from getting worse. Alcohol can, I think it's simple just saying any stress on the body will make whatever else is going on in the body harder to treat because it's an additional stress. That's the simplest way. So any stress. So
Great.
I hope that helps.
Yeah, and another one here. Does treating with topicals reduce risk of comorbidities?
That's a great question, Karine. We don't know if people with mild psoriasis, because topicals are only used to treat mild psoriasis, people with 3 or 4% on their body or less of psoriasis. We don't know if people with mild psoriasis even have comorbidities. Is there inflammation in their body enough? That's an ongoing area of research. So we don't know if even the first premise of that is true, much less whether the second premise of treating with topicals will reduce it. I would think so, but we still have to prove that first part, which we don't know. So that's a very good question, but we don't know if people with mild psoriasis who are using topicals actually have comorbidities to begin with. It's an active area of research, however.
All right, great. We have another question here. Can secondhand smoke inside my office cause flare-ups of my psoriasis?
Oh, I don't know. That's a great question, Karine. I can't answer that one. I don't know. I would think secondhand smoke is bad and can put stress on the body, but I don't know the details of secondhand smoke enough as a dermatologist. My assumption would be yes, but that's based on guessing, not clinical evidence.
Okay. And let's see here, one more question here. Why does psoriasis seem to have some level of symmetry associated with it? Example, if you have a lesion on the left, there might be one corresponding on the right.
The body is a very symmetric organism. Inflammation goes down the right as much as it goes down the left. The inflammation is equal. And when something is on both sides, actually it's a sign that it is an internal process happening sometimes. Because if it's on just one side, it can be poison ivy, for example, or something that doesn't involve an internal event or an allergic reaction. So on both sides, the body wants every place to feel that inflammation. It doesn't show any favoritism. Everything gets it equally. It's an interesting thing about the way our body works.
Great, thank you. Well, that concludes our Q&A portion of the webcast. And if you have any other questions, please contact our Patient Navigation Center by phone, email, live chat, or Skype. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate it if you would complete that and provide your feedback. We want to say thank you again to our sponsors, Eli Lilly. And finally, I just wanted to mention that a recording of tonight's webcast will be available shortly on our website, and you can access our complete webcast archive by visiting www.psoriasis.org/webcast. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight, and have a lovely evening.